The knot came loose again. Marcus watched it happen in the side mirror of his mother's car, the strip of navy fabric sliding apart for the fourth time in 10 minutes, and he pressed his lips together and started over. He had watched the video 3 times that morning, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark while Diane got ready in the bathroom, the phone propped against his knee and the volume turned low so she would not hear and ask what he was doing. He had practiced on a belt in the kitchen, looping it around the chair back until his hands learned the shape. He had left the house 45 minutes early so he could sit in this parking lot and get it right before anyone saw him walk through those gymnasium doors. He was 17 years old and he had never owned a tie before, and there was no one in the car with him to show him how. What Marcus did not know, sitting in that parking lot with his jaw set and his fingers working the knot for the 5th time, was that a man 2 rows over had been watching him for nearly 6 minutes. And what that man would do next was going to change everything. If you have ever had to figure something out alone that everyone else seemed to already know, stay. This one is for you. Marcus DeWitt had grown up in a 3rd-floor apartment on Clement Street, the kind of building where the elevator worked about half the time and the super took 3 weeks to fix it, when it did not. His mother, Diane, had raised him by herself since he was 4 years old, working days at the county records office and 2 weekend evenings at a dry cleaning counter on the far side of town. She was not a woman who complained. She packed his lunch in a paper bag every morning with a folded napkin and whatever was left from dinner, and she had never once let him see her count change at the grocery store, though he had seen her do it anyway from the corner of his eye, in the cereal aisle with her back half turned, and he had understood without being told that there were months when it was close. She had given him everything she could reach. The one thing she could not give him was the thing the apartment on Clement Street had been missing since before he could name the absence. His father, Ray, had left when Marcus was 4. Not a dramatic departure, no shouting, no packed suitcase thrown down the stairs. Just a Tuesday morning when Marcus woke up and Ray was not at the table and never came back to it. Diane had said very little about it over the years, only that some people were not built to stay, and that the people who stayed were the ones worth counting. Marcus had believed her. He had built his life on that belief, carrying it quietly through middle school and through the harder years of high school, through every father-son breakfast at the church that he attended with his Uncle Curtis instead, pressing into that pew beside a man who was always glad to have him there, but who was not the particular person the morning was designed to celebrate. Through every sports banquet where the other boys had their dads in the bleachers, he had been there alone or with Diane, and he had learned to hold his face steady during those events, the way you hold a door against the wind. He did not perform his grief. He filed it somewhere low and kept moving. By senior year, he had a 3.8 grade point average, a letter of acceptance from state, and a partial scholarship that covered tuition, if he kept his grades where they were. He had earned every inch of it the same way his mother earned the rent, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. The tie had been Diane's idea. She had found it at the thrift store downtown on a Saturday in April, still in its original packaging, a deep navy with a thin diagonal stripe, and she had pressed it against his collar in the kitchen and said it looked distinguished. He had never heard her use that word about anything they owned, and the way she said it, carefully, like she was placing it somewhere it would hold, made him stand a little straighter. She had paid $4 for it. He did not know that until later, when he found the receipt tucked inside the plastic wrapping, and he had not thrown the receipt away. She had to be at the records office by 8 on graduation morning, which meant she would drive him to the school, drop him at the entrance, and circle back 2 hours later for the ceremony. She had kissed him on the cheek in the car before she pulled out, told him she was proud of him, and then added, almost as an afterthought, her eyes already on the road, that she had not really known how to tie a tie herself or she would have helped him. He had told her it was fine. He had the video. He had his hands. He would figure it out. That was the word he used most often when people asked how he managed things. Figure it out. He had figured out how to cook rice and beans from a handwritten recipe card in the kitchen drawer. the handwriting his grandmother's, the cards soft at the edges from years of hands. He had figured out how to replace a bicycle brake cable with a tutorial and a pair of pliers, crouching over the bike in the parking garage with the instructions on his phone propped against the rear wheel. He had figured out how to fill out the FAFSA on the school library computer, tabbing through every field twice to make sure he had not missed anything, and how to write a personal statement about growing up in an apartment on Clement Street, without making it sound like an apology. Figuring things out was what he did in the space where other people had someone to ask. He was not bitter about it. He was simply practiced. The tie was stubborn. He had the loop right, he thought. The wide end crossed over the narrow end, then under, then through, then back down. The video had made it look like 3 motions. His hands kept making it 7. He could see himself in the side mirror of Diane's car, the collar of his white button-down open at the top, the tie hanging wrong, the knot sitting lumpy and off-center, like something that had given up. He thought, briefly, about the other boys at school, who seemed to move through these rituals with ease, boys whose fathers had taught them to shave and to drive, and to stand in a room like they had a right to be in it. He made himself stop thinking about it. He unwound the knot, smoothed the fabric against his chest, and started again. He did not hear the footsteps on the asphalt. He did not see the man until the man was already at his window. He was tall, somewhere in his 60s, with close-cut grey hair, and the kind of posture you noticed before you noticed anything else about him. The posture of a man who had learned a long time ago that a room would pay attention if you carried yourself like you expected it to. He wore a dark charcoal suit, well-fitted, no pocket square, and he carried a single graduation program rolled loosely in one hand the way a man carries something he has held so many times it has become part of the hand. He had come from the direction of the gymnasium, which meant he had been here for a while. He stopped a few feet from the car, not crowding the window, giving Marcus room. "You've almost got it," the man said. His voice was quiet and even the way a man sounds when he has learned to speak without needing the room to stop. "The last step is the part that trips people up. Mind if I show you?" Marcus looked at him. He was 17, and he was careful about people he did not know. The kind of careful that a boy who has grown up mostly in charge of himself learns early. But there was something in the man's face that was not a performance. It was just a man looking at a boy with a tie that would not cooperate, offering the one thing Marcus had been in this parking lot trying not to need. "Sure," Marcus said. He stepped out of the car. The June d'Oeuvre was warm already. The gymnasium's main entrance 50 yards ahead of them, families beginning to trickle across the lot in their good clothes. The man set the program on the hood and stood beside Marcus at the side mirror, not touching the tie, narrating instead, his hands moving a few inches from Marcus's collar. He walked him through each fold with a patience that was not performed, but simply present. The way a man is patient when he has done something so many times it has gone past mechanics and become understanding. Loose end under. Feed through the loop. Pull slowly, let the fabric seat. Adjust the dimple at the throat with your thumb. He was specific. He was not in a hurry. And then he did something Marcus would not forget. He reached up and straightened the knot with 2 fingers, set it square against the button at the top of Marcus's collar, smoothed the fabric once with his palm, and stepped back. "Distinguished," the man said. The word hit Marcus somewhere behind the sternum. It was his mother's word. He did not say that. "Thank you," Marcus said. He meant it in more ways than the tie. The man extended his hand. "James Whitfield, congratulations, son." Marcus shook his hand. The grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who had given and received 1,000 of them and understood what they were for. "Marcus DeWitt. Thank you, sir." He watched the man nod and retrieve his program from the hood and walk back toward the gymnasium, unhurried, a man who moved through the world at his own pace. Marcus stood by the car for a moment, alone in the June morning with his properly knotted navy tie and the smell of cut grass from the athletic fields somewhere beyond the building. He breathed. Then he locked the car and walked toward the doors. He did not yet know that James Whitfield had a son of his own who had graduated from this same school 11 years earlier and that son was no longer living, and that James Whitfield had come to this graduation every year since because he said it helped. Because being in the presence of the thing Darnell had done while Darnell was still in the world made some part of Darnell feel less finished. He did not know that the records office where Diane worked sat 2 floors below the county's property management division, where James Whitfield had served as director for the past 16 years, or that Diane had processed his filings dozens of times without either of them knowing the other's name. He did not know any of it. He only knew that a man had stopped and helped and called him son, and that for 30 seconds in a parking lot on a June morning, the absence on Clement Street had not felt quite so permanent. If you know what it is to carry something alone that was never meant to be carried, alone, then you already understand what Marcus felt walking through those gymnasium doors. And if you want to see where this story goes, stay close. Diane arrived 40 minutes before the ceremony started, which meant she was early enough to get a seat in the 4th row, close enough that she could see his face when they called his name. She had taken a half day from the records office, which she almost never did, and she had worn the blue dress she kept for occasions, the one she had bought 3 years ago at the department store on Central, and had worn 4 times. She sat with Marcus's aunt and uncle, Renee and Curtis, who had driven in from across town and who had brought a foil-covered pan of sweet potatoes to leave in the car because they intended to make a day of it afterward. She held her program in her lap and did not unfold it. She was thinking about the apartment on Clement Street and the scholarship letter taped to the refrigerator with a piece of masking tape because they did not keep magnets, and a 4-year-old boy eating cereal at a table that had become, somewhere along the way, enough. She was thinking about the tie she had found in the plastic packaging and how she had wished, standing in the thrift store with it in her hand, that she could do more for him than a navy stripe and a pressed collar. The gymnasium filled slowly. Parents and grandparents, and the sharp-dressed clusters of seniors in their robes, the smell of flowers and the particular blend of perfume and furniture polish and nervous energy that only these rooms hold on these mornings. Marcus found his row and sat with the other graduates, 12 seats in from the left, and Diane found him from across the room and held her eyes on him until he felt it and looked up, and they both smiled. It was a small thing. It carried 17 years of weight. The principal spoke, and then the class president, a girl named Tanisha, who had written her speech the night before according to everyone who knew her, and delivered it without notes, which impressed the room. Then a teacher named Mr. Gaines, who had taught English for 22 years, and who began his remarks by saying he was going to keep it brief, and did not, and who cried a little at the end of his remarks, which made the parents laugh with warmth. And then the names began. Diane did not hear most of them. She was building up to one. When they called his name, she stood up before she realized she was doing it, and Renee stood with her. And Curtis let out a low sound that was not quite a shout, but carried the same weight as one, deep in the chest and entirely involuntary. Marcus crossed the stage with his back straight and his tie square at his throat, and the principal shook his hand and said something to him that Marcus would not be able to remember later. Only the feeling of the diploma in his hand and the floor solid under him, and he carried it the short distance from one side of that stage to the other, with the same composure he had carried everything else in his life. Diane pressed her hand over her mouth. She was not embarrassed about the tears. She had earned them over 17 years, and she let them fall. What she did not see, from her seat in the 4th row, was the man in the dark suit, seated near the back of the gymnasium. Watching from the far edge of the room, she did not see him applaud when Marcus's name was called, or the way he held that applause a beat longer than the people around him. Hands coming together slowly and deliberately. The way you applaud when the name means something specific to you. She did not know that James Whitfield had looked up the name when he returned to his seat after the parking lot, found it in the program, and circled it with the pen he kept in his breast pocket. She did not know that he had sat with the program on his knee for the first half of the ceremony, barely listening to the speeches, turning over a question that had been formed since he watched a boy practice a tie. Lot and felt something in a parking lot that he recognized from a long way off. She only knew that her son crossed that stage hole and that the knot in his tie was perfect. After the ceremony, the graduates poured into the lobby and the parking lot, robes unzipped to the waist, flowers everywhere, cameras held up by parents trying to freeze the moment before it finished being the moment. Marcus found Diane near the main entrance and she took his face in both hands before she hugged him, the way she had done since he was small, as though she needed to make sure the whole of him was real. He let her hold him. He did not rush it. Renee was photographing them from 3 feet away, directing Curtis to move left and then right and then left again, and Marcus was laughing at the two of them when he felt a hand on his shoulder and turned. James Whitfield stood a half step behind him with the rolled program still in his hand. "Mr. DeWitt," he said. Marcus straightened. "Mr. Whitfield." Diane looked from one to the other, reading the current between them. "Your son fixed his own tie this morning," James said to her. "I just pointed." Diane looked at Marcus. He gave a small nod toward the direction of the parking lot. She understood. "Thank you," she said to James. There was more under the words than gratitude for a knot, and James heard it. "I hope you don't mind," James said. And he produced a business card from his breast pocket and held it out to Marcus. "I run the County Property Management Division. We take on 2 summer interns every year, paid positions. I have 1 slot that's open for September." He paused. "It would be worth a conversation if you're interested. The scholarship wouldn't be affected." Marcus took the card. He looked at it. The name was printed in plain black type. No flourish. The address, the county office building on 5th, the title director. He looked at James. "Why?" he asked. It was not a rude question. It was a genuine one. He had been around enough people in his life who offered things with strings attached that he had learned to ask. James was quiet for a moment. There was something in his face that Marcus had not seen earlier in the parking lot, a kind of weight that a person carries when they have lost something that cannot be replaced, and they have found a way to keep going anyway. He looked at Marcus with the directness of a man who had decided somewhere in the last 2 hours that the direct thing was the correct one. "I had a son," James said. "He graduated from this same school 11 years ago." He stopped there, the sentence complete in what it left unsaid. Marcus understood what the rest of it was. He nodded slowly, and he did not look away from James while he nodded. "What was his name?" Marcus asked. James looked at him. Most people did not ask that. They said they were sorry and changed the subject. "Darnell," he said. "Thank you," Marcus said again. He held the business card carefully. The way you hold something when you understand that it cost the person more than it looks. The 3 of them stood in the lobby a while longer, and Renee and Curtis drifted over. And there were introductions, and James shook hands with all of them and said very little else. The way a man keeps himself from saying too much when too much is close to the surface. He eventually moved toward the exit, pausing once to look back at Marcus in the way that men do when they are trying to hold on to something before it becomes a memory. Kindness carries weight, even when it looks like nothing more than a hand adjusting a knot. The world does not always show you its ledger, but it keeps one. Marcus spent the summer in the county offices 3 days a week, arriving at 8 and staying until 5, filing and sorting and slowly learning the shape of public administration from the inside. He wore a tie every day. By the end of June, he had developed the habit of laying his out the night before on the back of the chair. The way he imagined men who had been taught these things did it. He had learned 2 additional knots by the end of July, neither of which he strictly needed, a Windsor for formal occasions and a 4-in-hand that sat looser and easier for regular days. But he learned them anyway in the mornings before anyone else was up, the way he learned everything, slowly and alone, and until his hands knew the shape without asking his mind for permission. James Whitfield did not hover. He set Marcus up with a project coordinator named Evelyn, a woman in her late 40s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and who had been doing this work long enough to smell the difference between a kid who was there to put something on a resume and a kid who was actually paying attention. She tested Marcus in the first week by giving him a filing task with 2 intentional errors embedded in the instructions, an address transposed, and a date that conflicted with the form it was attached to, and she left him alone to work through it. Marcus found the first error in 20 minutes and the second in 40. He came to her desk and pointed them out without making it a performance, setting the papers in front of her and saying, "These two don't match each other. Can you tell me which one is right?" Evelyn told James on Friday afternoon that the kid was sharp and that she wanted to keep him through August if the budget allowed. James said he already knew that, and that the budget would allow it, and that was the end of the informal probation period, that neither of them had officially named. There were mornings when James would come by the workstation where Marcus sat, setting down a coffee for himself and leaning against the cubicle wall for a few minutes, and there would be a conversation, sometimes about a specific project, sometimes about state, once in a while about nothing in particular. The kind of easy talk that two people have when they are comfortable in each other's presence and not trying to fill the silence with anything more than it wants. Marcus did not presume on these exchanges. He did not perform gratitude in the loud way, did not find reasons to mention what the summer had meant to him. He showed up on time and worked clean and left the space the same way he found it, the way Diane had always kept the apartment on Clement Street, even when the building was falling apart around them. That was what he had. He gave it consistently. He asked James once, toward the end of August, whether James came to the graduation every year because it made him feel close to Darnell or because it gave him somewhere to put the day. They were standing at the window of the break room, the city spread out below them in the late afternoon heat, and James held his coffee and looked at it for a longer moment than Marcus expected before. He answered. "Both," he said. "Some years more one than the other." Marcus nodded and did not press it. James looked at him then with something that was not quite gratitude but was close to it, the acknowledgement that a person had understood something without needing to be walked all the way to the door. Diane heard the story in pieces, the way she heard most things about Marcus, not because he kept secrets from her, but because he was private in the way she had raised him to be, careful with what cost him something to say aloud. She heard about the morning in the parking lot from Curtis, who had heard it from Renee, who had pried it out of Marcus at a Sunday dinner 2 weeks after graduation, using the patient, warm, relentless conversational approach that Renee had deployed on every DeWitt in the family at one time or another, and from which no one had ever successfully escaped. Diane sat with what she heard for a few days, going over it in quiet moments at the records office before she brought it up with Marcus directly. "You should have told me," she said. They were at the kitchen table, the same one they had shared for 13 years, the surface worn at the two places where they always sat. "I didn't want to make it sad," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It's sad," she said. "It's the opposite of sad." She went to the records office the following Monday and looked up the name in the county directory. James Whitfield, Property Management Division, 5th floor. She had processed his filings for 6 years without knowing anything about him except the file numbers and the neat printed handwriting on the forms. She did not go up to the 5th floor. Instead, she wrote him a note, 1 page on county letterhead, brief and plain, the way she did everything that mattered. She thanked him for the morning in the parking lot. She thanked him for the summer position. She said that her son was the kind of person he was in part because of small kindnesses like that one, the ones that cost a person something to give, because they require stopping when it would be easier not to. She did not say anything about Darnell. She folded the note and slid it under the door of the property management office on her lunch break, and walked back down the stairs and went back to work. James read the note standing at his desk, still in his coat from lunch. He read it twice. He folded it along the crease she had made and placed it in his breast pocket, alongside the graduation program from Darnell's ceremony 11 years ago, the paper worn soft at the fold from being carried so long. He kept the note there too. From that day forward, the two things pressed together in the inside pocket, where a man keeps what matters. The summer ended. Marcus packed what would fit in 2 bags and a cardboard box, and Diane and Renee and Curtis drove him to campus on a Saturday morning in late August. The car, loaded with bedding and a box fan, and the set of kitchen basics Diane had been assembling quietly since April, buying one thing at a time when things went on sale: a pot, a colander, a cutting board, a good knife. They carried it all up 3 flights in a dormitory that smelled like industrial cleaner and something else underneath it. The particular smell of a building that has held a great deal of beginning. Curtis assembled the flat-pack bed frame with tools from the trunk of his car, and a confidence that suggested he had either done this many times before or was too proud to admit he had not. When the room was set, and the bags were unpacked and the fan was plugged in and tilted toward the bed, Diane stood in the doorway for a moment with her arms folded and her chin slightly lifted, the posture she had when she was feeling something she had not yet found the right word for. Marcus stood beside her. "You figured it all out," she said. "I had help," he said. She looked at him. He was wearing the navy tie, loosely knotted over a plain white shirt, because he had put it on that morning before the drive and then decided not to take it off. He was not sure he could have explained why, if someone had asked. It was not a performance. It was more like a reminder, the way you keep something in your pocket that has weight, so you can feel it when you need to know something, is real. She reached up and straightened the knot. He let her. They stood there for a moment in the doorway of that room, the two of them, the way they had stood in every doorway of every hard thing for 17 years, side by side and steady, neither of them rushing the moment, and then Marcus shouldered the empty duffel and walked Diane back down the 3 flights, flakes, to where Curtis and Renee were waiting by the car. And the campus spread out in the late August light ahead of him, wide and unhurried and full of what came next. James Whitfield came back to the graduation the following June, and the June after that. He sat near the back with his rolled program, and he applauded each name, and he thought about Darnell, and he thought about all the boys and girls in those seats, figuring out right now how to carry what they had been given. Sometimes on the drive home, he thought about a navy striped tie and a side mirror, and a boy with his jaw set who had not asked for anything until he was offered it. He thought about how close he had come to not stopping. He had been halfway to the gymnasium doors when something had made him slow and turn and look back, and even now he could not name exactly what it was. Only that something in the boy's posture had been familiar in the way that certain things are familiar when you carry them yourself. He thought about what it cost a person to try again on the 5th attempt when the 4th one had already come loose. He thought there was a kind of courage in that which had nothing to do with the big moments, nothing to do with the stage and the diploma and the handshake. It was the small courage, the one nobody put in a program, the one that happened in the quiet with no one watching, except sometimes someone was. Marcus called him in October of his freshman year. From a study room in the campus library, a glass-walled room where he had spent most of the previous 3 evenings working through his economics coursework. He had gotten a B+ on his first university paper, and he wanted to tell someone who would understand what the grade represented beyond the letter, someone who had seen him at the beginning when he was still learning the shape of things. James answered on the 2nd ring and listened and said, "Good, the single word carrying more than a word usually carries." Then he said it again. Then he asked what the paper was about, and Marcus told him, and they talked for 20 minutes about labour markets and county procurement practices, which Marcus had seen from the inside during the summer, and which had given him, James said, a kind of concrete understanding that most first-year students spent years chasing in the abstract. Before Marcus hung up, he said, "Thank you again for the summer position." James said he was the one who should be saying that. Marcus did not push back on it. He let James have it, the way you let someone give you something when you understand that the giving matters as much as the getting. He wore the tie to his academic advising appointment that week. His advisor, Professor Okafor, a man who had come up through a public university himself, and who had a particular attentiveness to students who were working twice as hard as they, let on, noticed the tie and asked about it across the desk in the way professors ask about things when they mean something other than the surface. Marcus said his mother had found it at a thrift store downtown. Professor Okafor looked at it for a moment and said there was no better kind. "Yeah, graduated again," In May this time, walking across a larger stage in a larger gymnasium, with a degree in public administration and a job offer already in hand from a city planning office where he had interned his junior year. Diane was in the 5th row. Renee and Curtis were 2 seats down from her. James Whitfield was near the back, by the aisle, with a rolled programme. When they called his name, James stood up before anyone around him did, and the people nearby looked over at this man in the dark suit, standing alone with a programme in his hand. And he did not explain himself, and he did not sit down until the applause was finished. The tie Marcus wore that day was not the navy one from the thrift store. That one was folded on his dresser at the apartment near campus, kept there carefully. And not because he had stopped wearing it, but because this particular morning felt different enough to deserve something he had chosen himself. The new one was a deep charcoal with a pattern so subtle it only showed up in direct light. He had knotted it in the bathroom mirror that morning, in the way James had shown him in the parking lot, which by now lived so deep in the muscle memory of his hands that it required no thinking at all, only the doing of it. He adjusted the dimple at the throat. He stepped back and looked at himself for a moment. Distinguished. He was the first of his family to hold a 4-year degree. He would not be the last. That was not something he knew yet. But it was the direction he was already walking. After the ceremony, Marcus found James near the side doors of the building, where the May light came in at an angle across the lobby floor. They shook hands, and James put his other hand on Marcus's shoulder and held it there for a moment, the way a man does when the handshake alone does not quite hold everything it needs to carry. Diane came up behind Marcus and shook James's hand too, and Renee photographed all 3 of them standing together before anyone thought to arrange themselves. And the photograph came out the way photographs do when no one is performing for the camera. The 4 of them stood in the sunlight outside the building for a while. Diane and Renee and Curtis and James. The loose and particular family that a life makes when it is lived with enough steadiness and enough grace. In the middle of them, in his charcoal tie and his pressed suit, and felt the good weight of it. The kind that settles in the chest when the things you reached for through the long years finally land in your hands. Kindness is never wasted. Not the kind that stops in a parking lot because a boy needed a hand. And not the kind that shows up every year to a gymnasium to sit in the back and be present for what someone else built. It moves in ways you cannot trace. It lands where you cannot see it landing. And sometimes, years later, it stands in May sunlight with its hands full and its collar straight, and it looks exactly like this. What would you have done if you had seen that boy in the parking lot? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want to hear another story about what happens when the quiet thing someone does in private comes back to change a life, that story is waiting for you right now.